Hello, today I'd like to speak to you about a very interesting disclaimer of onerous property case. And it is re Potters Oils Ltd. The citation is 1985 1 BCC 993. It's a judgment of Mr. Justice Harman, Jeremiah Harman, a very interesting judge that we don't have time to look at now. We're going to concentrate on his very elegant judgment in re Potters Oil, which was of course a case that dealt with not our current disclaimer of onerous property section, which as you know is section 178 of the Insolvency Act 1986, but instead Mr. Justice Harman was dealing with section 323 of the Companies Act 1948, so a forerunner provision to the one which we would now consider. Well, the facts in this elegant judgment were this. Basically, you had a liquidator of a company, re Potters Oils Ltd, and that company owned some chlorinated waste oil that was held in some tanks in a water treatment area. And the tanks, importantly, were not owned by re Potters Oils Ltd. They were owned by the Central Electricity Generating Board. So the tanks which the chlorinated waste oil was stored in are owned by somebody else. The cost of disposing of this potentially hazardous waste was, and don't forget this is 1985, the sum was £14,500. And the liquidators obviously didn't want to pay that sum to get rid of the so-called hazardous chlorinated waste oil. I'm being careful with the word hazardous because, of course, at the time the local environmental health officers didn't think there was anything necessarily wrong with the oil, the waste oil, to the extent, of course, as we see from the judgment of Mr. Justice Harman, that there was nothing onerous necessarily about that oil as and therefore reason why perhaps it should be allowed to be disclaimed pursuant to section 323. So we get to the judgment, and what is it? Well, it's, as I've already said, a very elegant judgment of Mr. Justice Harman, where he examines the minutiae of section 323 and the facts of the case, and in so doing comes to the conclusion that the liquidators cannot disclaim this property. They can't get it out of the estate and the associated costs of dealing with the estate, what is now, of course, the estate as defined by section 436 of the Insolvency Act 1986. Here in re Potters Oil, Harman says no to the liquidators. You cannot do this because there is no onerous act which the mere possession of the waste oil forces upon the liquidator. Accordingly, the court has no jurisdiction to allow the liquidator, the office holder, to disclaim that property. There are a couple of interesting points to note. I've referred to the judgment as being elegant. Why? Well, on a couple of occasions, Harman uses language that's interesting. Of course, one example is this damnosa hereditas clause that he uses, which, as you know, means a harmful inheritance at Roman law. And then he goes on to use the term incubus, which some of you will know is a form of demon that allegedly hovers over ladies whilst they're sleeping and gets up to mischief. If Harman is calling this chlorinated waste oil either an incubus or some harmful inheritance, or potentially harmful inheritance to whoever next owns those tanks that the company ownership exists in, the, of course, chlorinated waste oil within the tanks, but not the tanks themselves. As you know, they are owned by the Central Electricity Generating Board. If Harman's referring with these quite severe terms to the oil, but then holds that, of course, it can't be disclaimed. Is this not a bit inconsistent? How can the oil be simultaneously not something which is problematic and has to be dealt with, whilst also being an incubus or a harmful inheritance? So mull on that as you look at Harman's judgment in re Potters Oil Ltd, and think about the incubus, think about that harmful inheritance, or the damnosa hereditas, as you progress through what is a relatively short judgment. One which, as I've said, concludes with the liquidator not being able to disclaim that chlorinated waste oil. In our subsequent videos on disclaimer, we will focus on some later cases where we see that disclaimer has been allowed. Until then, I'll bid you goodbye.